Welcome to Ending Jet Lag, and today I'm with Dr. Matthew Weaver. Dr. Matthew Weaver is an epidemiologist at Mass General Brigham Hospital, and he also works with Harvard. He's an instructor in medicine at Harvard in the sleep and circadian rhythm. Welcome aboard, Dr. Weaver. How are you
Thanks so much.
today?
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. And just tell us a little bit of your background and how you ended up here in this space.
Sure, sure. Um, so I'm from Western Pennsylvania, a fairly rural area in sort of northeastern United States. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Pittsburgh, and in the course of doing so, acquired this research assistant position, which was in the Department of Emergency Medicine there. Became very interested in public health and academic research as a course of kind of doing that path through EM. I did an undergraduate degree in emergency medical services and worked as a paramedic for 7 or 8 years in the Pittsburgh area. And that led me to become very interested in shift work and the
Mm,
timing of this and the safety of different shift schedules. And I pursued a doctoral degree in epidemiology and completed that, and then was looking for a postdoc opportunity. And I found the Harvard Work Hours Health and Safety Group had been cited throughout my dissertation work.
mm.
So I contacted some of the members of that team to see if it would be possible to train under them, and was able to gain a position to do a postdoc at Harvard with that group.
Wow.
Um, and after that was complete, I just stayed on as a faculty member, and I've been there ever since, doing the
Right.
same type.
And Harvard does have the reputation. I think Professor Charles Chichester, was he there? I
Yes, Dr.
believe.
was still my mentor. I did my
Oh,
postdoc under
fantastic.
Dr. Seisler and Dr. Laura Barger. Yeah.
Seisler, is it? Okay. Right. No, I cited him in my thesis when he talks about business travelers traveling in a cloud of caffeinated jet lag. And I thought that was just a wonderful quote. So you've been researching shift work and we talk about social jet lag a lot when, your workday doesn't line up with your own circadian rhythm. So what have you been finding in terms of shift work? Uh, what has most and least impact?
Um, so a lot of my work is focused on the duration of shift schedules rather than rotation necessarily.
Okay.
Although we have looked at rotation in some small extents, but what I have found is what I've tried to do is do really sort of pragmatic studies that try to examine at what like sort of what tipping point does a schedule become more risky or
Hmm.
have worse so, for example, in some of my earlier work in emergency medical services, we were able to look and see that after people were on duty for more than 12 hours, the rate of occupational injuries started to rise.
Hmm.
We've also done a lot of work in physicians in training or medical residents in the United States, and they're they've gone through an evolution of restrictions and sort of lack of restrictions in the duration of the schedules that they're allowed to work.
Yeah.
Um, And we've followed in three separate cohort studies under sort of a condition where they could work up to 30 hours at a time, uh, and 80 hours per week, averaged over 4 weeks, to a condition where they were restricted to no more than 16 consecutive hours. And then after that, once again, allowed to work up to 24 hours plus 4 hours for transitions of care. So effectively 28-hour shifts.
So
And we found, yeah, good.
that I am horrified. I'm horrified that a doctor is working 28 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, they do it a lot less than they used to, but I mean,
Good.
in the early 2000s, this was quite common. It's a very normal thing to do. And there was, I think, a groundswell within the medical community saying, this is unsafe. And there's good, well-supported research studies, both randomized controlled trials and observational trials that showed that you limiting people to no more than 16 consecutive hours reduced the number of medical errors, reduced the number of crashes on the commute home from work. Um, produced improved mental well-being as well. So those restrictions ultimately came into place on the basis of that prior research, and they existed for about 5 years. But it is a complicated problem in that the supply of medical residents is constrained. It's funded by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and there are powerful forces sort of on both sides of
Mm,
this issue who, they want to be able to design their own schedules without someone dictating what they should be. And ultimately, in 2017, those restrictions were lifted, and now they again work. They are allowed to schedule them to work, as I mentioned, 24 hours plus four continuations of care. And generally now, they'll spend about 1 month of the year where they work 2 or 3 or 4 of those shifts at most places. So it's much more constrained, and we're happy that it is much more constrained, but
yeah.
continue to feel the evidence shows that it really shouldn't be necessary at all. Um, that's-
Yeah, that's horrifying for me. First of all, do these people working the 20 hour do they have a nap somewhere, or do they have settings for some sort of sleep? Because I couldn't stay awake for 20 hours, 8 hours consecutively.
I think it all depends on the setting. I mean, a lot of these are most prevalent on ICU rotations. And
Yeah,
these are academic teaching hospitals and major urban teaching centers. So there's always plenty for them to do. We have asked in the past how much sleep people are able to get on shifts. And that amount of sleep that they're able to obtain has gone down substantially over time. So now, on average, if someone's on one of these shifts, they'll report sleeping on average about, I think, 1.4 hours in total over the course of that shift. But I think more than a third are completed without any sleep at all. So it's a busy job. They have a lot of things to do.
yeah,
There's a little opportunity for sleep, and there's rarely a dedicated space in a hospital for people to obtain that sleep, even if they had an opportunity to do so.
right. That is horrifying. I would imagine, working in intensive care, you need all of your faculties there. You need to be very focused. This is literally life and death. These are the most vulnerable patients, the most at-risk patients. So, um, and I do remember, you spoke about crashes, and I do remember a case some years ago of a young doctor who had a fatal crash on her way home from one of these types of shifts. And there was a lot of grief in the medical community because someone had died very young who was all set to have a very fulfilling career, and the career literally killed her.
Yeah.
So um, that's just horrifying.
Yeah, it's very real. I mean, that was one of the
Yeah.
landmark papers that my mentors published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2004, that following one of these extended duration shifts, the risk of a crash on the commute home was increased nearly fivefold. And, to be able to estimate that statistic and show that it is raised on that type of shift schedule means there are these crashes happening, and it's not
Yeah.
as in should like. So now I think we're focused on trying to provide support systems. I think hospitals now are much better about providing transport home for individuals if they are
Mm,
asked to work extra shifts. They have access to rideshare, which didn't used to
yeah.
be possible. But it's still, it's something I think the data, as I mentioned, showed pretty clearly. Sh it's safer not to do them, and it doesn't seem necessary to do them. And as we increasingly sort of recognize the problem that exists in many professions, but also in medicine of burnout and mental health and
Mm,
well-being, we know that sleep is such a powerful contributor to our own mental
yeah.
health. And we wonder how much of a component sleep is playing and these types of schedules are playing in that
Yeah.
aspect of the medical
Yeah.
life.
That's, I mean, the risk to the doctor's health and well-being to me seems pretty substantial. And also the risk to the patient's health and well-being. And I remember seeing a case in a drug in neonatal intensive care some years ago. The drug was meant to be 5 milligrams per kilo, and the doctor had written 25 milligram, and the child died.
Uh,
Um, and it went to court, and colleague, it was just awful, awful. How much of that error would happen, say, 16 hours onwards? That would be have to be high risk. The risk of serious, potentially quite serious medical errors. If I was
Yeah.
in intensive care, I don't think I'd want the doctor to be awake for 28 hours.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's an important point. And we showed in several years ago that after the 2017 regulations, which limited consecutive work hours to no more than 16, that medical errors were reduced 60% following the institution of that guideline, looking at the two cohorts before and after the policy. So
yeah,
it had a real benefit when it was
yeah.
restricted. And I think what the other thing I want to follow up on that you mentioned is that you do wonder how ethical this is. We undergo an informed
Mm,
consent process when we have a surgery, for example.
yeah,
And my mentor, Dr. Seisler, who you mentioned earlier, has written about this in the past, about how, we know that our decision making is impaired, our reaction time is impaired. We are worse on a variety of tests after
yeah,
a certain sleep deficiency has taken place.
yeah.
Shouldn't this be part of the informed consent process for patients? Um, should they have an opportunity to say, well, I'd like someone else to do this procedure? And I
I'd
think
like
that's a
someone
fair,
who's awake.
yes, I think it's a
Yeah,
fair, yeah,
I think so, and it's not just doctors' rights here, and doctors' rights are important. I think doctors are
yeah,
entitled to a safe workplace, a healthy workplace, not something that's going to cause potential harm to them, even on the way home. And patients are also entitled to a safe hospital. I'd want a doctor that's awake and alert. Um, I have seen a bit of this myself in the hospital system, but that's going back some years, so I can't give you anything up to date what's happening in Australia. But certainly, I was on call for long periods, but I wasn't expected to actually be in the hospital for 28 consecutive hours. That's beyond horrifying. But
yeah. I don't want to deter people from going to the hospital or a scourge or anything like that, but
no,
this is, an area of my research that I do feel passionately
mm,
about. I think the evidence is pretty
yeah,
clear on the issue, but yeah, it's persisting. Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting. We've got an organizational culture, and this sort of crosses over into organizational psychology, which is my area of interest, that we just kind of accept it. It's like suck it up, buttercup. It's almost you know, the hospital's like, this is what you do. You're a doctor and you have to be here, and this is just how it is. We have an organizational culture. I couldn't imagine, for example, in most blue collar professions, I couldn't imagine this being tolerated.
Yeah.
We talk about factory workers in China doing what they call 996, where they work from 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. 6 days a week.
I've heard this, yes.
And yeah, and we have horror stories about people falling asleep in the factories that assemble, smartphones. But this is worse. This is so much worse.
I don't, I don't know comparatively, but I mean, it is certainly a real issue, and I think it's
Mm,
contributed to the rise in unionization that we've seen in physicians in training in the U.S. There's been quite a rapid increase in unionization efforts, and I think just over the past, since 2020, where increasingly major academic medical centers or the residents have become unionized. And the work
mm,
hours are one of the issues that have been reported by them to be driving this, but it's also other things that are obviously important to them, like
yeah,
um, you know, fam family planning, um, like supports for ch childcare and family planning
yeah,
and things of that nature. But it's
yeah.
one of the issues.
Yeah, no, I can understand. That would be a significant workplace issue. I mean, there are others which don't really intersect with what we do, childcare and what have you, and they're all valid issues. But I think there's something at the root of the organizational culture where it's like, yep, this is just what doctors do. you're a
Yeah.
doctor and this is what you do. Is that something that's come through in your research, some sort of attitudes there?
Yeah, for sure. Not so much in the research side of things, but when I've presented findings to groups of residents and their leadership, it has been, it's, they don't explicitly say necessarily like I did it this way, so you should have to do it too. But they would pose like, to give an example, um, we may have to be on our feet for 20 hours to do a surgery when we're attending physicians leading that surgery. How will we know that we can do that if we haven't done it in residency when we're being supervised at the same time? And I think I kind of like I understand their point, but I don't know that it's helpful to.
Mm,
It's sort of like one of the things my mentor would say would be going to um, if you're going to try to train someone to deal with sleep deficiency, it's what's the analogy? He compared it to starving someone before trying to walk across a desert. So if you know you may have to do some arduous task that you can't plan for necessarily or necessarily know exactly when it's going to happen, the best way probably to prepare for that is to make yourself as resilient as possible by getting sufficient sleep as often as you possibly can, so
yeah,
that when that time comes, you're able to have a little bit more resiliency in the moment, not doing the opposite.
absolutely. And let's talk about burnout. Is that something you've seen a lot? And how does that look?
Yeah, I mean, at at our hospital, we found through some internal surveying that sleep problems were one of the major drivers of burnouts several
Something,
years ago. And we had done a study where we surveyed our academic faculty. We had them, we sort of took over our grand rounds presentations that happen every month in all the different divisions.
I
And
remember
we gave,
Grand Rounds.
yeah, we gave a sleep health and wellness program sort of presentation where we sort of gave suggestions on how to optimize your sleep health, sleep hygiene tips, and at the end,
Mm,
we screened everyone for sleep disorders. So they all had an iPad underneath their seat. They'd pull it out, they'd do a quick survey, anonymous, and they'd be screened for obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, restless leg syndrome, shift work disorder. And we analyzed the results from that and found that screening positive for a sleep disorder was associated with significantly increased odds of occupational burnout, because they
yeah,
also took that scale in there. And it didn't really matter what disorder it was. It was mostly driven by demographics, and that men were more likely to screen positive for obstructive sleep apnea, for example. Women were more likely to have insomnia. Obstructive sleep apnea was like comparatively probably a little bit worse than the other ones, but screening positive for sleep disorder was associated with sort of a fourfold increase in the odds of
yeah,
burnout at the time. So we have looked at it from that perspective and know that, it's not surprising that having poor sleep that is fragmented or made more deficient by having a sleep disorder does increase your odds of burnout. We know there's a
yeah.
bidirectional relationship between sleep and mental health symptoms.
Mm,
And that, if you improve your mental health symptoms, you can improve your sleep. If you, sort
yeah,
of goes both.
yes. And I hate the thought. I absolutely hate the thought of these doctors who are working these crazy long shifts, that their lack of sleep is having that negative impact on their mental well-being. Yeah, I want any doctor attending to me, if I'm in intensive care, to be absolutely sharp and not to be dealing with burnout or mental health issues or you know, that sleep. That is terrifying. Um, and I don't know how we change this culture, but I think it's very stubborn. But I hope we're making first steps. Do you see any developments in this area in the last few years or coming up in the next few?
I think so. I think, as I mentioned, this happens much more infrequently than it used to. So there has been a cultural change.
Hmm.
So despite the fact that they were restricted for a period of time and that restriction has been lifted, they're still being worked way less than they used to be worked. And that is not only true for first year medical residents, but also residents in more advanced years of training. And these rules that had restricted shifts only applied to PGY1s or residents in their first postgraduate year.
Right.
And despite the rules only applying to them, over time, we see this temporal decrease in the frequency of extended shifts across all levels of training. So I think that does indicate to me a cultural shift moving away from this. Yeah, we're allowed. Some program directors may still implement them occasionally, but I do think it's becoming more and more infrequent as the data do show. And I also think it's part of the consideration for people choosing a program. That's
Mm,
a back and forth relationship where you learn about what your colleagues prioritize. Do they take care of you as you're training there? Are they looking
yeah.
out for your well-being? And I think it's a factor that is weighed. Yeah.
So I'd imagine you can, you can enter these programs voluntarily and go, no, not that one. Is that what you're seeing, or
I'm saying the match process here is a whole different system, but I do think, you go around and you interview and you decide, you rank the programs yourself and then
yeah,
they rank you.
yeah,
And I think in talking to people, they do care about working conditions and work-life balance and the
absolutely.
ideas and attitudes of those who will be overseeing them and training them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That organizational culture is so important in
Yeah.
a workplace, and not just in terms of supporting sleep, but generally. Um,
Mhm.
I can think of one research institution I worked at that there was an absolutely toxic work environment, and it told me what not to do in a workplace. But um, but having that, um, do you see, for example, lawsuits could be potentially driving, because if a doctor is at increased risk of making a mistake, there is increased risk of a lawsuit happening. Could that possibly be a factor? The threat of legal action?
Um, I don't know, to be honest with you. And certainly there are famous cases that brought about the beginning of restrictions. I mean, the first restrictions in the early 2000s really stemmed out of a famous case of medical error that happened in New York. Um, it was the Libby Zion case.
Right.
So if anyone wants to look that up, that's sort of the origin of work hour regulations among physicians in training in the United States. New York instituted some rules, and it led to greater attention on this issue and greater study. There were national rules put in place in 2002, 2003, and then people started studying those fairly intensively, and we've grown from there.
Yeah. Okay. And it might be a factor, but it's not necessarily a decisive factor, but a few other things. And you've also mentioned that physicians are becoming much more unionized
Mhm.
in the workplace a lot. Is that helping drive the change as well? Is there some negotiation
Um,
happening there?
I mean, we recently published a paper on unionization among resident physicians, and well,
Oh,
like I mentioned, work hours were one of the factors that were weighed in their decision on how they would vote for a pending unionization. Compensation was up very high, and as I mentioned,
yeah,
childcare, family resources were also quite high, but work hours was the second ranked variable that they listed
right.
back.
Okay, so compensation was first and then work out. Yeah,
Yep.
that's understandable. And simple things like having a taxi home. I remember working in clinical research and I had a shift answering the phones before we got set up and ended at 3. And so I got given a taxi voucher because there was no other way for me to get home from the inner city. Um, that's something that hospitals are doing, just rather than having fatal car crashes on the way home.
Yes, that's true. Most often here it's a ride share, so an Uber or a Lyft or something like that,
Okay,
or a taxi program. But in general, yes, the hospital does in most cases. have resources for people to access. Now, there is not always a one-to-one on, people knowing that those resources are available to them and utilizing them, which I think is
Right.
there's sometimes a gap there, but
Oh, okay.
it is.
So the doctors may not be aware that there is a rideshare service available to take them home when they need to.
I Yeah, I mean, previous work has shown, like with most benefits programs, I think our hospital offered like Headspace for us, the meditation app, like Calm or Headspace, and it
Yeah.
was present for several years before anyone sort of found out that, wait, we could get this for free. And I think that's true with a lot of things that the hospital is like in good intentions providing resources to employees, but there is that next step in making people aware and optimizing the utilization of those resources.
Yeah, communicating it. Perhaps the unions could play a part in that. Perhaps hospitals could be more proactive, saying, "Hey, here's an announcement. We've got this, service, this app, this whatever."
Yeah.
So, providing workplace safety. So, I think there's some important lessons in workplace safety, both for the doctors and the patients. And I think the research you're doing is absolutely wonderful in this space.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
you haven't do you have you found anything about the change of times in shifts, like morning shift to evening shift to night shift, or is it because yours these shifts are so crazy long that it's all just one big shift? 28 hours, it's just a day shift.
Yeah. We have examined it to some extent in mostly other settings. So we've done one study where we collected data from a diverse sample of healthcare workers at several different hospitals, looked at their shift schedules and the direction of their rotation, and we found that rotating night shifts schedules were associated with an increased odds of depression and anxiety, and also worse sleep problems. And there's sort of a multiplicative interaction between those two things. So if you had
Mm.
um, sleep problems, it significantly increased the risk of depression and anxiety that much more. And we know from circadian biology, just general basic science principles that have been done in other work that the direction of rotation matters a lot. Rotating backward is much, much worse than rotating forward.
Oh,
So
now rotating backwards versus rotating forward. Can you elaborate this for me? Because this is quite interesting.
yeah, if it's necessary to do rotation of shifts, rotating from 7 a.m., say you have 7, 3, and 11, so standard
Yes.
like night,
Yeah. Yeah, they're pretty standard here too.
going from starting at 7 to starting at 3 to starting at 11, rather than trying to go in reverse. And for
Ah,
reasons, some industries do have a common reverse type shift schedule, and it's very, very difficult to adapt to that.
because if you rotate forward, you have phase advance to adjust, and if you're rotating backwards, it's phase no, sorry, phase delay and phase advance. Yeah, so it's kind of like flying west versus flying east, is
It's
it?
exactly, yeah. Yeah. So if you're always getting later, you're flying west, which we all know is way easier. Um,
Yes, east is a beast, west is best.
that's because we have a greater capacity to delay in our,
Hmm,
setting of our circadian rhythms.
yeah.
And on average, most of us have a intrinsic period of our circadian rhythm that's a little bit longer than 24 hours rather than precisely
Hmm.
24. And there's some individual variation in that, but usually what we need to do is expose ourselves to some light in the morning to advance. And that's harder for most people when we have ample access to light in the evening, which makes us delay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no.
And
Right. And this, we've talked about doctors in the medical profession and hospitals, but this also applies outside to, police, security, firefighters, other emergency workers as well, that are not necessarily medical, but still, I want the police to be alert, not half asleep and making stupid decisions.
yeah.
Have you done research much outside the medical profession?
Um, we've done we've done a lot of what I would consider pragmatic work that is sort of can that sometimes be quality improvement. But we've studied emergency medical services workers, firefighters. Before I joined the group, they had done multiple studies of police officers, yes. Right now,
Right,
we work with some different aviation groups. We've done work with railroaders, for example, as well.
right.
Um, One of the things that I think is so interesting about sleep and circadian rhythms is you could pick any topic you're interested in, and there's going to be a sleep or circadian angle to it, for sure.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what I find with jet lag. It seems to work its way into everything. The circadian rhythm is everywhere once you look for it.
Yeah, it's
It's,
true. I mean, you could look
yeah.
at if you're interested in athletic performance, particular times of day are optimized. How do you prepare for the travel? Yeah,
I wrote a paper about Olympic medal counts and jet lag a few years ago, so very familiar with that one.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and the Australians did well at the last Olympics because they prepared so hard. Because Paris is a long way from Australia.
Do you know if they had a structured template going in? I'd be
They,
fascinated to learn.
I didn't know going in, but they were very aware of the circadian rhythm going in.
Yeah, yeah,
They prepared they paired athletes up with the same chronotype, so they'd have morning people and evening people together, so they
that's
wouldn't
smart.
disturb each other.
That's
And they had all the light because Qantas, which is the national airline, has got the lighting system in the planes for
yes.
the um, Sydney to London, Melbourne to London routes, which they're the Dreamliner. So
Yeah.
blue light to wake you up and red light to put you to sleep and all that sort of thing.
Yes. Yes, one of our collaborators is working on a research study from that. And I think that's that's a great example of applying sleep and circadian principles to improve people's lives. If you can help adapt on the way there, your time
Yeah.
there in the first couple of days is going to be more enjoyable. I think that's a great idea.
One of the things I have found annoying with long distance flights is flights that make you shut the window or shut
Mm.
the blinds, not the window, because you don't open the windows on a plane, but shut the blinds like, no, I want them open. I want to adjust to the local time. I don't want to stay in my departure time. So,
Yeah.
but I think that is for the cabin crew because they don't want to change their circadian rhythm. They want to
Oh,
stay on their home base, and I think it's for the benefit of them rather than the benefit of passengers.
I never thought about that, but yeah, that would
Hmm.
that would make sense.
No, I do remember some years ago flying from London to Bangkok, and they wanted us to shut. And I just want like to look out the window anyway, but I'm sort of sneaking a look and blocking off the light and peering out, and because I do like the view from 30,000 feet. But yeah, but I think
Absolutely.
that's for the benefit of the circadian rhythm of the cabin crew, not for the passengers.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, they deserve to feel good too. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been great chatting with you. It's given me food for thought, and I look forward to seeing some of your more of your research.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Steve. It's great to meet you.